Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you haven't guessed from the title of the video already, today we're going to talk about something a little controversial. So the context behind it is that I was scrolling through my Twitter feed a couple weeks ago and I encountered this repost of a Tumblr which was titled, "Why do so many white people speak non-white languages?" And the post reads, "Cultural appropriation is a real issue, okay? One of the worst cases of this is in the realm of second languages. Caucasians love to appropriate cultures through language as a way to intrude on the lives of those who might not speak their language. It's seen as fun or interesting. For those of you into anime, I'm sure you're aware of the weeaboo problem. Some white anime fans love to appropriate Japanese hairstyles, musical tastes, and even the Japanese language itself. Spanish is another issue, and Tumblr has had this debate before. You see so many white kids at high school or college who are proud to be able to speak Spanish. Why not speak a European language like German instead of appropriating the culture of minorities?" So it's easy to see why initially nobody really took this post seriously. This girl seemed to miss that Spain, where Spanish is originally from, is white and European. Obviously not really a culture that would be considered by any means a minority. And then I decided to just investigate, and I found that somebody actually had reached out to her and asked her on her Tumblr exactly this question. Now, her answer: the majority of Spanish speakers are Latin American. They live outside of Europe and are not white. Additionally, your white European coworkers have privileges Latin Americans do not have unless Trump is building a wall on the border of Spain. So this response of hers in particular illuminated much more than her original post what she actually meant behind her argument. I realized from this that it actually had nothing to do with learning languages in itself, but specifically she was using language learning as an example of the real problem that she was addressing, which is the unfair differences between privilege in minority versus majority groups. So for this video, one of the things I'm going to do is address and dissect two of her main points in the original post. That white people taking part in Japanese culture is cultural appropriation, and B, that white people speaking Spanish is cultural appropriation. Spoiler alert, I disagree with both. So as far as appropriating Japanese culture goes, there have been loads of articles and videos and other media of people asking Japanese passerby in Tokyo or Hokkaido or whatever, what do they really think of Americans and other foreigners cosplaying and becoming weebs and learning Japanese? And all of these people are completely flattered by the fact that foreigners, non-originally Japanese people, are interested enough in aspects of their culture to actually partake in it.
こんな感じのイメージなんだろうなっていう、海外の人が着物とか日本の文化取り入れてこういうことやってくれるのが普通に嬉しいなって思います。外人さんでも結構似合うもんだね。そうです、そうなんですよ。コスプレとかも結構外人がやった方が高かったりとかして、嬉しい、むしろ嬉しい。日本人ってあんま日本のものを発信したりとか、発信するのが下手だったりとかするんで、海外の人が日本のやつ発信してくれるのすごい嬉しいですね。なんかもっとやればいい。もっとこういうのが広まっていってくれたらいい。僕は全然日本人なんで、いいんじゃないかなと、もっと好きになってくれて、日本のことをもっと発信していってくれたりとか、好きになってくれたら嬉しいですよね。いいと思います。日本が好きだということでいいと思います。別に否定する理由もないから。まあ個人的にはこれネガティブだとしても僕は別にいいと思います。なんか嬉しい的な。
Similarly to this case, there was not too long ago, there was that white girl in America who wore the Chinese traditional dress qipao. Americans were all annoyed. They all called it cultural appropriation. There were tons of articles and Facebook posts and whatnot about the whole issue. Essentially exploded in outrage about it. But when mainland Chinese people were asked about how they felt about their point of view, They were also flattered that she considered their traditional dress to be beautiful and to choose to wear it to an important life event of hers, such as like her high school prom. So as a result, like, it appears that there's a very specific way to determine whether a particular group of people will determine something to be cultural appropriation or not. For instance, if you are not a minority and someone partakes in your culture but with good intentions, you'll be flattered. And someone partakes in it but has bad intentions to be like offensive or any other thing, you'll be upset. And similarly, obviously, if you're a minority and someone comes along and partakes in your culture with bad intentions, of course you'll also be upset. But the interesting case is if you are a minority and someone has good intentions, how you feel about it completely depends on the differences in treatment and experience applying that aspect of culture between those two groups. So if the minority was like, had bad experiences partaking in their own culture, and the other group had good experiences partaking in the same aspect of culture, whether it belongs to them or not, then they'll be upset and consider it cultural appropriation. Obviously, this is really generalizing a really complicated topic and emotionally sensitive thing, but this is just kind of, I think, a way to compactly think about it. And now for the Spanish speaking. Given that she specifically mentioned Latin America, Spanish, white people, and Trump, I think I know exactly what her frustrations are actually geared towards. Living in America. And if you know anything about what a lot of people here are like, despite America not having and never having had an official language, you will very, very often see a media portrayal of some white man or woman scoffing at a Latino or Latina, saying, "You're in America, speak English."
We're in the United States. And in the United States, we clearly speak English.
Mm-hmm.
That language I don't understand, and therefore it makes me angry.
So, Latin Americans are criticized for speaking Spanish, but then on the contrary, white people are praised and applauded for learning and speaking Spanish. What? So this is clearly an instance where it has to do with minority versus majority. By learning and speaking Spanish, white people aren't inherently appropriating anything. It's just that Latin Americans are justifiably angry and upset that whites, being the majority in the United States, reap the rewards and climb up the ladder by speaking Spanish due to their privilege, and whereas for Latinos, speaking Spanish somehow has the complete opposite effect. So I was glad that I didn't have to disagree with this Tumblr girl on the fundamental principle that language learning itself is not cultural appropriation in the vast majority of cases. However, through my research of looking for different perspectives and other people's opinions on this question, I learned that there are unexpected ways that it actually can be. And if you're curious, just keep watching because I'm going to address that real soon. But before I begin to explain why, I feel compelled to first note that there is a difference between culture and ethnicity. These are very, very, very often conflated to be the same thing, and especially on the internet. And they can be related, but I consider them different. When you are born with a particular ethnicity. And regardless of this predetermined ethnicity, you may begin to cultivate your sense of identity based on the culture that's embedded in your surrounding environment, whether it corresponds with the culture and language that is usually associated with your ethnicity or not. And therefore, you can be any color of the spectrum and relate best to Japanese culture if you were, say, born there, or if you were adopted into a Japanese family, if you lived in a predominantly Japanese neighborhood, if the majority of your friends were Japanese people, etc. So many other ways. And for this reason, I'm a firm believer that language is something that all humans share and that the cultures of the world belong to all of us. So, and here I'm specifically referring to culture and not to ethnicity. Because neither language or culture is something that is pre-programmed into your DNA. You cultivate your own identity based off a combination of influence, of environment, and your personal choices and preferences. Culture and identity are things that are constantly evolving through our experiences and interactions as we exist in this world. And so therefore, you can choose to identify however you want. And this has been clearly established in the LGBTQ community. You can identify however you want. But in all senses of that identity, you cannot. It does not give you the right to prevent others from identifying similarly and thus from also participating in that culture. So yes, our mother tongue helps us form our identity and shape our perceptions of our surroundings, but learning a new language means having the opportunity to open up a new door to a new world and have the opportunity and experience and getting a chance to appreciate a completely new culture and getting the chance to appreciate new perspectives, aka a new culture, and perhaps therefore modifying how you think and perceive the world to be overall, and opening up connections to new people and experiences and ideas that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Additionally, I believe language to actually be like a sort of reflection or alternate representation of a culture. And you'll see this when you learn different languages and you notice that oftentimes things get lost in translation. And this happens for a reason. Like some things that you can say in Russian, you cannot say in English the same way with the same connotation and the same nuances and the same emotional impact. Like some words that exist in one language may not exist in another. And this kind of things actually can give you insight into the culture. And what that means is like, if one culture doesn't have a word for a particular color and one does, this means this one, by not having that word, either they don't know about it or they don't value it, or it's maybe considered to be something taboo or evil or whatever. Whereas this one, it means that they value in particular that color enough to give it its own word. You can go even further, which I find this part extremely interesting. You can go even further and look at like the etymology and the historical background of how a word is like formed. And by doing that, you can find like what that word represents in that language or how it might be perceived. Like rather not how the word is perceived, but how the thing that the word represents is perceived. A really good example of this actually, really quick, is the Chinese word for maternal grandmother, 外婆, where 外 means foreign or outside. So this kind of gives you a feeling for how the maternal side of the family was once treated as like not in the new family once you get married. They're outsiders who don't share the new family's surname anymore. So kind of in that way, sharing a language can mean sharing a culture with someone. And it can make you feel like immediately closer to this stranger that you just met if you find out like, oh, they speak Russian too. Oh my gosh, that means they immediately probably understand all the different linguistic things that Russian has to offer. They understand like the food. They know the different cultural stuff that makes Russians different from Americans. You assume that you have like kind of the same understandings about the world with this stranger, and that makes you immediately more comfortable with them, or at least that's something that happens with me with Russian people. And this is a huge part, I think, of the reason why language learning has the potential to be a form of cultural appropriation, though this is mainly in the cases of like endangered or indigenous languages. Now, to really feel this, recall the struggles that I mentioned earlier that minorities have in like practicing their culture, like the Latinos speaking Spanish in America, right? Now imagine being like an ultra minority, where the number of people who speak your language and practice your culture is essentially equivalent to just the size of your family. Sure, like extended family or just, direct family. Your main concern would then be to maintain the language and the culture and make sure that like your children continue to keep it alive, right? That they have all the opportunities to learn the language and stuff, right? Then imagine suddenly someone from outside your family, like a stranger from like school or a different country, just like shows up at your doorstep and they're like, hey, can I learn your language too? How would that make you feel? Like, honestly, like, think about it. Like, I think if I was in that situation, I'd feel I would definitely question their intentions, and I would probably feel like a little threatened, because like your family's intention of learning the language is to preserve your culture and like keep it alive, right? To stay close to the family and be a part of your community. But what would the intentions of this outsider be? Either they like think that they can like save you all by learning your language, which is almost never the case. And like, just to note, this whole like threatened feeling and like questioning intentions, that doesn't really happen with the main like big world languages like Chinese and English and French and whatever, because those languages have millions of speakers. Like, one new person learning that language won't really do much to impact it. However, for endangered languages with like as little as 200 or 20 people, one person, just even in a ratio, is certain to have like a huge impact, right? Makes sense? Now, you don't think one person can actually make or break a language, do you? Well, you better, because in my research I actually found out that there have been cases where one person was the tipping point for an endangered language to live or die. Sequoia helped the Cherokee people develop a unique writing system for their language, which ultimately led to one of the components of their survival. But conversely, a much more tragic situation was when Daniel Everett came to study the Piraha language in the Amazon basin. It ultimately put them at risk of complete extinction. And this is because his research promoted the Brazilian government to impose its Portuguese culture into their lives by means of like installing TVs and electricity and forcing the kids to go to school where only Portuguese is taught. So, and also I read a really good article by Tate Walker, and it was called 3 Questions to Ask Yourself Before Learning an Indigenous Language as a Non-Native. And in this article, she describes her own experience of how a white linguist began to study her native Lakota language, and in a few years turned around and started posting on forums suggesting changes to the Lakota language to try in an effort to make it closer to Latin structures, and suggesting changes as to how it should be taught in general. But this guy, he neglected to learn or study the culture of the Lakota people, only the language. He then also created his own language program for learning Lakota, all of which was compiled from resources that he had studied from Lakota elders. And he did not see his privilege in having the opportunity to study this language as someone not originally part of this native indigenous culture. So, and this all ties back to the main idea of privilege, right? She writes that you as a white person can simply choose to learn a native language however, whenever, and from whoever you want. And that is the epitome of privilege. The fact that you're learning for leisure or interest or even for work, whereas natives are learning for literally survival of their culture. She also asks the reader to consider that native people weren't allowed to legally practice their own spiritual beliefs until just recently. They were massacred by the US military for it. And recall that language and culture, and therefore also spirituality, are all intimately tied. The boarding schools would beat the language out of native children. And those children then grew up into adults who sometimes refused to speak their indigenous language for fear of putting the next generation into the same abusive situation. Language classes and or transportation to classes can be inaccessible to natives, whose communities are often plagued by extreme poverty. Additionally, in some areas, there aren't even opportunities for natives to study their language or culture from elders. Actually, another really good point that she made in this article was that most white folks, though I'd say it's more general than that, like most people, but Most white folks learn other languages only insofar as those languages relate or translate to English. For instance, asking what's the word for bathroom in X language versus asking, to be respectful, should I ask certain people in specific situations about things relating to bodily function? She says learning cultural intricacies, like the value of interpersonal relationships, comes later, if at all. You may think that her version of the question is a little excessive, and that asking for the translation of a word that's very commonly used in your daily life in another language is harmless and completely reasonable. And I agree, but I also understand it in my own way. Certain things that are fine within your culture may be very taboo within another one. Personally, I can actually relate to like a form of this feeling. So in America, cursing is something that's like very colloquial, very normalized. Most people do it. It actually kind of like informs you of like more emotion of the person who's speaking, or like more expression of what they're saying, as well as like potentially a really simple way to kind of build trust and realness between people talking. And it makes you almost like closer in the conversation immediately because of it. You feel like they've opened up to you somehow. However, this is at least in my personal experience, though I've like shared this with other people and they have also agreed with me. In Russian, cursing is something extremely looked down upon, and something that is so offensive to me that I flinch whenever I hear someone say it. And many people, especially people that I'm like not really friends with, but they're like friends of friends, and they're like, oh, you're Russian? That's so cool. And they'll just casually ask like, oh, how do you say like in Russian? Or like even worse, they already know how to say it and they'll just like go out and say it to me. And what they don't understand is that due to this like difference of how cursing is received in Russian versus English, they don't realize how uncomfortable it makes me to hear these words. So to kind of wrap it all up, cultural appropriation is a very real issue, don't get me wrong, but importantly, it's also a term that is very, very often misused to describe things that may upset a certain group of people who suffer from the effects of being an underprivileged minority. And language learning is not inherently a form of cultural appropriation, although with the wrong intentions, such as for disrespect or for self-profit, or with ignorance or neglect in respecting foreign cultural differences, especially those that are endangered or indigenous, it certainly can be. So I know this ended up probably being like kind of a long video and kind of just like my opinion, my discussion of stuff. But like, what do you guys think? Do you think that language learning is more cultural appropriation? Do you think that the things I said, like, do you agree? Do you disagree? And like, if you're learning languages, which I assume you might be if you're watching this, what are your intentions and drives towards learning languages and like studying them, and why do you want to do it? What makes you want to do it? Leave me a comment down below and let me know, because I'm genuinely really curious about like other people's perspectives on stuff and why they do what they do. Make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to me if you want to see more videos from me. I know I don't upload like that often, but these past like 3 weeks I got sick with pneumonia. Then just this morning I got like my wisdom teeth taken out, so I'm like, you know, follow me on Twitter if you'd like. See ya later.